Hello and welcome to a special GZERO live stream presentation. The topic of today is it a missed shot? Whatever happened to equitable distribution? I'm Natasha, Kimani, a research and media program lead at Africa No Filter. Greetings from Nairobi, the most beautiful city on the continent. Over the next hour, we are going to attempt to answer that question as the world marks the second anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. I should note that as we have this conversation today, we are obviously closely watching the ongoing war in Ukraine. But this pandemic has also caused enormous suffering and has expanded already existing equality gaps. We are going to talk about that, as well as concrete steps to prevent a public health crisis of this scale from happening again. Our program is brought to you today by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We'll hear from leading experts in public health, research, development, and philanthropy. And most importantly, we will hear from you, the audience. You can weigh in as well. Before this program, we posted some viewer poll questions across social media. We'll share those results and you can vote here too. If you're on GZERO's site right now, you'll see a chat window to the right of the video screen on a desktop or below the player on a mobile device. Log in there to please cast your vote. The first question: where are we globally in the COVID-19 pandemic? Are we nearing the end, somewhere in the middle, or no end in sight? As you consider your response, let's ask our first expert. Dr. John Nkengasong is Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Welcome, Dr. John, and we are so proud of the amazing work you've been doing for the continent. Dr. John, what's your answer to the question we just asked our viewers? Where are we globally in the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you. As I said before, it depends on where you sit. If you are sitting in Africa, the glass is half empty. And if you are sitting in the global north, the glass might be half full. We just heard yesterday in President Biden's State of the Union address, the optimism that he expressed in that, rightfully so, because many more people have been vaccinated in the United States. We know that we've seen what is going on in the UK positively. So the optimism and the drive to open up the society and return to normal, that is not exactly what we are seeing in the part of the world that I'm serving and that you and I are serving. I think there is still a lot of skepticism. There's still a lot of concern that this pandemic in the part of the world that we operate is very unpredictable and still very, very uncertain in terms of the trajectory. So my response to that first question would be the glass is either half empty or half full, depending on where you sit.
Okay, great. So the glass being half empty and half full, would you say then we are somewhere in the middle? It sounds like that's your response to this particular question. And
my answer to that is that how can you say that the glass is half full if in a continent of 1.3 billion people, about 12% of the population has been fully vaccinated. And we are striving to get to at least 70% of the population fully vaccinated. You can still in that, with that statistic set, argue that we are beginning to see a predictable inflow of vaccines on the continent. And now our efforts, collective efforts must be geared towards getting those vaccines into the arms so that we beef up that percentage to at least 70%. So that is the optimism of part of that low statistics there. So, but we must acknowledge this. I think a few weeks ago, I made a statement that we should actually be focusing a lot more on the vaccination part of it rather than acquiring more vaccines. And we stagger it such that the vaccines, when they arrive the continent, are actually used rather than stockpiling the vaccines and getting the risk of expiration. And the headline was that, I asked for a pause for vaccine donation. That is not what it is. I think it is no point having huge amounts of stockpiles of vaccines in the warehouses and not putting them into the arms. I was at the meeting with the Minister of Finance of Nigeria just last week, a meeting, a very successful meeting organized in Abuja. And she echoed the same sentiments. She said Nigeria has received so many millions of vaccines, and they have used probably half of those vaccines. So it's a call, an honest call to action, that if we want to have the glass half full and begin to express and feel that sentiments of optimism that we are seeing in the developed world, let's do something and do it quickly to vaccinate, to move those vaccines into the arms.
Thank you, Dr. John. Those statistics are a bit disheartening. 12% is quite low. Just to follow up on that, and before we get into the next question, let's see how the viewers voted. Great. So exactly, these are the numbers in. 45% of the viewers feel that we are nearing the end. 33 believe that we are somewhere in the middle, and 22% believe that there's no end in sight. Dr. John, what do you think of these findings and the perspectives that the viewers have? Is there room for optimism? People are ready to go out and forget that COVID ever happened. What are your thoughts?
Right. I mean, my thoughts, I think that the statistics or the respondent confirms more or less what I talked about, the glass being half empty or half full. I mean, if you look at that first bar, I think it was like 45%. And but if you combine the second bar and then the third bar, it speaks to that uncertainty that we are in there. I think I must add that, so it confirms my assertion, but we must also, at least those in the first bar, the 45%, say that let's approach that optimism with caution and with humility, because there's a lot we've learned about this virus. There's still a lot we need to learn about the virus. I just say this and I'll end here, that just today we are learning reports about the Omicron Delta variant reported in the UK by the Public Health Institute. That is a combination of the Omicron and the Delta variant. I think we should be extremely cautious that as we approach that. But it is always important to be optimistic in public health. Let this be very clear. We shall overcome this pandemic. I mean, the question is how soon or how late it will be. But let's exercise humility. Let's exercise caution that we've learned a lot from this virus. We still have a lot to learn from the virus. I say this as a virologist, and I know how challenging viruses can be if you underestimate their ability. We are dealing with a very determined enemy. Let it be no doubt in anyone's mind.
Thank you, Dr. John. There have been nearly 6 million deaths worldwide from COVID, and the current state of recovery from health and economic perspectives globally is uneven at best. Would you care to explain this and just expound on how the current state of the economy and the health perspectives that we could gain from this particular crisis?
So I think that if there's anything we've learned from this crisis is that a disease threat is no longer a health issue. It is an economic issue. It is a development issue, and it is a serious, and I say this deliberately, a national security threat to our population, I mean, to the countries. I think I'm very pleased to note that in the coming weeks, the African Union Peace and Security Council, which is the most powerful organ of the African Union, will be having a special session to discuss disease outbreaks and COVID as a national security threat. So in terms of development, we have seen how economies across the world have slowed down. We've seen how on the continent of Africa, they are bracing or actually going through a recession in 25 years, which is something that has not seen, and all of that directly related to COVID pandemic. I'll say this, I'm one of those that never stopped traveling the continent. I think when people talk about lockdowns or being in isolation, I didn't have the luxury of having that because you have to move across the continent. And even to countries that denied that they didn't have the virus, I had to go there. I had to be sent there as an AU on behalf of the AU to go to Tanzania to convince the leadership there to accept that there's COVID, to go to Burundi to see. So I've never, but when you flew across the continent and you saw airlines all lining in Nairobi, or you see Ethiopian Airlines all lining in the tag bags there. You see, that is not what planes are supposed to do. Planes are supposed to be flying, not staying and line beautifully at the airports as if it was a fashion show. It was very, very disheartening to see that the shocks that we observed when we're all running around with military planes on the continent trying to support member states with that. So I think I will just end by saying that perhaps, and just perhaps, the economic shock of this, what we are going through and have gone through, will only be felt in the next couple of years. I mean, severely, I will just add.
Dr. John, thank you for that. Let me show you a graph that depicts administered doses per 100 people in high, upper middle, lower middle, and low income nations as of the end of 2021. How do you square the idea that the emergency phase may be ending, but this kind of vaccine gap exists? And what about access to therapeutics, PPE, testing, etc.? Dr. John.
No, absolutely. In 2020, we fought this pandemic with public health measures. I mean, it was like we were fighting a war with our bare hands because we had no tools, right? In 2021, we fought it with vaccines, and even those who didn't have the vaccine, we had hope for a vaccine. I think that must be stated. And in 2022, we must fight this virus with all the tools that we have on our hands. And that includes testing. Is that echo coming from my side? That includes self-testing. No. And we've just issued guidelines yesterday on self-testing so that we can democratize self-testing, make it easy, people test, take their own personal responsibilities. We must scale up vaccines so that those numbers you saw on the chart begin to come up evenly. We must make sure that we have access to the new drugs that are becoming available. Paxlovid and others must be available in hospitals in a timely fashion. That is so important to prepare for the next variant that may actually cause severe disease. And that way people can be treated and you keep them out of hospital and make sure that our health system are not overwhelmed. And of course, lastly, that the public health measures that we have all used to, we continue to maintain. Now, if we do all those four things simultaneously, then in 2022, we will be, I call that a combination approach to fighting the enemy there. Then in end of 2002, we might be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, we truly don't know what Omicron has done in terms of what I call vaccinating the world. And we are beginning studies at the Africa CDC, several surveys to see the extent to which antibodies are present on the continent. We will be publishing studies, a report very soon. We've submitted that report in the Lancet to explain the extent to which people have been exposed on the continent. But a new study to look at the extent during the COVID period is very important. I say this just to make a point that we need to continue to drive our sessions as to how the pandemic will end and where we are heading with strong evidence, strong data, quality data. I think that is so important to make a definitive conclusions as to the direction and trajectory we are heading.
Thank you, Dr. John. As we sort of ride on the wave around data and evidence, I would like to very quickly share some statistics, and especially one that's a bit worrying from this same report. In a study of 8 low to middle income countries, it was estimated that as many as 80% of COVID deaths could have been prevented had those nations been vaccinated at rates comparable to high income countries like the UK and the United States. That brings us to the central question we asked at the beginning of this program: whatever happened to equitable distribution? On that, I'd like to bring in Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Mark Sussman, CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome to you both. Mark, despite declarations and verbal commitments, equitable distribution has not been a reality. How do we better ensure that words translate into action moving forward?
Yes, well, as Dr. John pointed out, this is the reality we face 2 years in. The world has not provided equitable distribution of vaccines and other life-saving treatments, and that cost has come in terms of lives lost that could have been saved. The intent was very different. At the beginning of the pandemic and when we were helping set up COVAX and other initiatives like that, the commitment made by original countries that before any vaccine had been proven to be effective was to try and at least have equitable distribution for the highest risk portions of the population all over the world and for healthcare workers, because we knew those were key elements. And there was agreement in principle when there was no vaccine. Once there was a vaccine available and multiple vaccines, then the domestic political pressures in high-income countries took over, and the pressure to just maximize domestic vaccination helped distort the market, did not help provide the doses to those most in need, and we had a little bit of a free-for-all. I think the lesson for that going forward are twofold. One, we still need to address the current crisis, as Dr. John talked about, and that means providing the resources, particularly to allow for effective vaccine delivery in the places that are still under-vaccinated, and that should still be prioritizing, targeting those higher risk groups, many of whom are still unvaccinated. But we do need to look also at that broader repertoire of treatments and other tools. And at the Gates Foundation, we've been working to see if we can help use some of our financing to accelerate the manufacture at scale of versions of some of the new treatments like molnupiravir, which is one of the treatments, so that we can actually have volume available at scale for developing countries at the same time as high-income countries. And going forward, I think that's going to be the major lesson for the future. We need to have in place, ready to go, tools and structures, both on the surveillance side, but on the research and development side and the manufacturing side, so that we are able as a world to create and respond at high volume very quickly in the space of a couple of 100 days to future health threats like this, because that's going to be the key to allow us to have equitable distribution going forward. So we need to tackle the inequities we're still seeing today, and we need to put in place an infrastructure for the future that says for the next health crisis, we don't face this situation where we have unnecessary deaths and huge global inequities in access to treatments.
Ian, it begs a question. If a crisis as huge as this one can't foster adequate global cooperation, what will? You've noted that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought renewed energy to transatlantic alliances like NATO. Could that lead to greater cooperation on other issues?
I think the answer is yes. And I think we have to admit that the pandemic wasn't a big enough crisis to actually shake some of the sclerosis, both domestically and internationally, out of the deeply dysfunctional geopolitics that we have. The US-China relationship had no trust in it before the pandemic hit, and arguably it got worse as a consequence of the pandemic. The same thing has been true inside the United States in terms of red versus blue state, and the politicization, even of basic science, even of basic healthcare, has become much more politicized. The CDC in the United States is less trusted today on the back of the pandemic. And not really because of the pandemic, but rather because the pandemic wasn't big enough to force red states and blue states not to politicize their response. So is the potential for direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia big enough to create further cooperation? Of course, the answer to that is yes. But I would say there are two different components of this that are relevant for the pandemic and the way we think about global health and economic integration going forward. The first is that I do think that transatlantic cooperation will be lasting and meaningful beyond simply the issue of NATO and security structure. So, for example, the UK relationship with the EU through the Brexit process has been so deeply broken. I think this Russia-Ukraine crisis will make that easier. And a UK that has a better and more coherent relationship with the European Union is a useful thing to respond to global health and to support IMF and climate discussions and all the rest going forward. I think that the willingness of the Europeans to be more flexible in terms of their fiscal spend going forward and not return to austerity this year, which otherwise we would have seen, will be useful in conversations that this group is having with the Germans, with the French, with the EU leadership, to get them to take more leadership going forward in terms of how we respond to global health challenges, to pandemic challenges. those are positive silver linings that come out of this crisis. The one that we just don't know yet is China. Right now, the Chinese are friendlier towards the Russians, but they are deeply unhappy about the idea that the Russians have invaded, that this isn't a diplomatic outcome. They have offered to provide some sort of good offices to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia after President Zelensky asked them to. That's just literally in the last few hours. But are we going to come out of this crisis with a China that the United States and the Europeans can work more with? We looked into the barrel of the gun and we realized that we can negotiate together. If that were true, that could clearly facilitate more cooperation in how to respond to global health and economic crises going forward. But it is equally possible that we will come out of this crisis with a Russia that is much more economically, financially, energy, and technologically integrated as a supplicant with China. And that a Cold War 2.0 isn't just about Russia, but that increasingly China is a part of it. And if that happens, then the ability for us to work together with the Chinese on these global challenges on the health and economic side, which are obviously critically integrated, will actually get much more challenging. That's a huge question going forward on the back of this crisis.
Thank you, Ian. I don't know whether to be optimistic or scared. I think I'll sit squarely in the middle. It's time for another viewer poll question. Which of these has been the biggest roadblock for pandemic recovery? Vulnerable health systems, political division and national interests, or inequitable response? Ian, there's domestic politics and geopolitics. Both had an impact in this pandemic. What role did each of these play?
Well, the geopolitics were uniformly negative. The fact that we have a global order that lacks leadership, both on the security side, on the trade side, that our global institutions have eroded in part because they no longer align with the balance of power globally, and there's very little willingness to spend the resources required, to take the risks required to adapt those institutions. That made the WHO much weaker in effectiveness. That made the United States willing to leave the WHO under President Trump in the middle of a pandemic. What an obscenity that was, right? So the geopolitics were incredibly negative for the response to this crisis. On the other hand, the domestic politics completely mixed. In China, the domestic politics allowed you to track, to trace, to quarantine, to lock down faster and more effectively than any country in the world at scale, but then also made them much less flexible in changing that response to Omicron, and stick with a zero COVID policy that may well be much more problematic for themselves and for the rest of the world in terms of supply chain, travel, you name it. Where, the United States, the domestic politics were incredibly negative because the maximal political fragmentation and dysfunction in the US played out on every aspect of the pandemic, to the extent that COVID is increasingly a lifestyle issue in the United States on the basis of who you identify with politically. A crazy thing to think about, right? Masking, vaccines, social distancing, you name it. It's more about what political tribe you're affiliated with. But for most countries around the world, that wasn't the case. For South Korea, for Japan, for Greece, for Uruguay, rich and poor countries, large and small countries, wealthy and poor countries, so many examples where the leaders took leadership and led with the science. And as a consequence, the performance of those countries was significantly better than what you see in the United States, for example. And that's because the domestic politics did not play a significantly negative role in hindering the capacity to respond to this pandemic crisis.
Thank you, Ian. We will now very quickly get into the poll results. And the question was, which of these has been the biggest roadblock for pandemic recovery? 11% of the viewers feel that it's vulnerable health systems. 73% political division and national interest, which is quite aligned to what Ian was speaking about earlier. And 16% believe it is inequitable response. Dr. John, before we say goodbye, Many health experts have pointed out similarities between the rollout of HIV drugs decades ago and how vaccine was or wasn't distributed in Africa. What lessons from HIV/AIDS apply to this current situation?
Plenty of lessons. I think, I believe it was, I can't recall who mentioned the inequities that we had at the start of it, but inequities that we all, before vaccines, we all said, we all agreed that the common principle that we should all share. And then when the vaccines were available, we didn't share. That was, we saw that same playbook during the early or mid-90s when ARVs were introduced and they were highly effective. I remember as a young graduate student in Vancouver, we were all impressed to see the power of HAC, as they used to characterize it, highly active antiretroviral therapy. And if you look at the graph, and I look at that graph, and I've published on this in Nature very early on to use that to make a case for equitable access to vaccines, that the death rates decreased significantly in Europe and in North America, but in Africa, it would take 10 years before you saw that the death rates begin to decrease because of the introduction of ARVs. And thanks to programs like the PEPFAR, the United States President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, and Global Fund. We warned that scenario could play out. We warned that early on before vaccines were available. We wrote that commentary in Nature and saying that let history not repeat itself, but unfortunately it repeated itself. So I think it's not lack of the expression of principles on the pulpit that we collectively didn't do. We were all saying the right things. COVAX was a good example of where I've always characterized COVAX as a good expression of solidarity and cooperation, but which, of course, translating that into action and implementation became very challenging for all the obvious reasons we know. And so I think there's a lot of parallel lessons to be learned between equitable access and timely access to vaccines during this pandemic and ARVs in the mid-90s. And I'll just end by saying that during that time period, 12 million Africans died unnecessarily because those 12 million lives could have been saved. I've grown, in my 32 years in public health, I've grown to know that it is not the number of deaths that really cause people to be awake. It's something else, and we still have to find that something else. Otherwise, 6 million deaths out of COVID in just 2 years will be a awakening call for all of us, an alarm call to all of us. When we were all in that research period in December 2019, we just didn't know that a virus that was being floated around or described or alerted on news media in Wuhan will cause 6 million deaths 2 years later. And if 6 million deaths are not enough to shaking us, then I really don't know how big a crisis could be. Of course, you could also argue that in 1918, the pandemic that hit the Spanish flu killed about 50 million people in 2 years. But at that time, we were at a very different pace in the human history and humanity. Science was very limited. I mean, they ended the pandemic without knowing what was going on. It's only in the 1930s that they were able to sequence the virus to know what they were dealing with. But today, with the science that we have, I think we need to really look at the value of deaths, where our inventions are not being taken up into in all communities at the same time.
Thank you, Dr. John, and thank you for joining us. Once again, we are extremely proud of you for leading us and hopefully to the other side of this pandemic. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Will this pandemic lead to greater resilience and health security in the future? Our final conversation today is about the road ahead. Ian Bremmer and Mark Sussman are still with us. And I'd like to welcome Melanie Saville, Director of Vaccine Development and Research at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and José Manuel Barroso, Board Chair of the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, and former President of the European Commission. Melanie, let's start with you. If COVID is moving into endemic phase, what is the road ahead for continued vaccine innovation?
Thank you. Maybe to start off with, really to say the progress that's been made in vaccine development over the pandemic has really been quite extraordinary. I think we've put 10 years of development into less than a year as an example. And I think we all realize that the pandemic has many twists and turns, and we all need to live with COVID-19 moving forward. So although we have seen extraordinary progress, I think it's fair to say there's much more that needs to happen in terms of innovation about the vaccines that are being rolled out, continuing to gather evidence of the effectiveness and the safety of those vaccines. How long will the efficacy last? When do you need boosters? Are all the sort of questions that do need continued research as we move forward. But we also need to look at the next generations of vaccines. There are improvements to be made. For example, improvements in cost of goods, improvements in cold chain management so that the vaccines can use the normal cold chain that any vaccine can use, which is particularly important in lower middle income countries. And even looking at vaccines that could have a better impact on transmission. Perhaps one of the things to really highlight is variants. We have seen variants of COVID-19. We should assume that that will continue. And the question of the need for variant vaccines, work is being done on variant vaccines, and that is necessary to move forward. But we are at the moment one step behind the pandemic and the variants. What we need to do is get one step ahead. So we really need to look at the innovation that is there in terms of developing more broadly protective COVID-19 vaccines that will protect broadly against both the existing variants and the ones that are likely to emerge in the future. And this is one of the areas that CEPI is certainly looking at. We've made 6 partnership agreements so far with the developers who are really looking at innovative ways in terms of design of vaccines. And of course, all of these things can be used in the future, potentially for future pandemics as well.
Tell us specifically about CEPI's 100-day plan for vaccine as new pathogens emerge.
Yes, so CEPI and we've all learned a lot through COVID-19. And if I just take you to COVID-19, the first vaccine was rolled out 326 days after the sequence was identified in COVID-19. At that point, there were 68 million cases. The question is, what if we could have done that in 100 days to first roll out? When there are only 2 million cases, how much more impact could vaccines have had in the COVID-19 pandemic? So how can we apply that in the future? So we've really looked with the whole ecosystem as part of our forward 5-year plan for $3.5 billion US. What are the elements that we need to work on to get to that 100-day mission? And maybe just highlight 4 of those now. And really the first of those is, how can we accelerate each step of the development process to make even more progress safely? And the kind of example you can have is in 1950, a Formula One car took a minute to change the tires safely. Now it takes 2 seconds, and that's meticulous attention to the whole development process. So we need to look at that very carefully. But we also need to do what we can to prepare for the next pandemic. And in this context, what can we do to learn about viruses, make prototype vaccines so that we have a lot of information in advance of the next pandemic? So we're looking at virus family vaccine libraries, so prototype vaccines in a library that can rapidly be brought out when a new virus emerges. A third thing to look at is manufacturing. We've spoken a lot about the inequity One of the main reasons for that is the manufacturing is in the north. So we really need to think of each continent having the manufacturing capacity so close to wherever the outbreak is. So helping to build that capacity and sustain that capacity will be critical moving forward. And then lastly, really just thinking about what can we do from a clinical trial perspective, from a regulatory perspective, to really transform the way we look at new viruses when we move forward.
Thank you. Jose, you recently said that Gavi needs at least $5 billion more by the end of March to continue to deliver vaccines at scale. Why is this additional funding necessary and what's at stake?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in this event organized by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and GZERO. I know that this can be debated because we can say that now we have too many supplies. And it's great that for the first time now, we have supplies that are exceeding demand. That's good news for all those in the world that have not yet had the shot. And there are many, namely in Africa, but not only in Africa. So that's good news that we'll have now probably more supplies. But the fight against COVID-19 is not just about getting vaccines, it's also about vaccination, to really get the shots in people's arms. And so now the priority will be delivery. And when I mean delivery, I mean, for instance, ancillary costs like syringes, transportation, insurance, but also we have to think about resilience and about preparedness. And this virus is still there. I'm not an expert in immunology, but I've been, because of this position I have now, in touch with the best immunologists in the world. And what they tell me, and the public opinion, in fact, is that it's not over. Some people seem to think that it's over, but it's not. It's still there. And the possibility, I would say the probability of new variants is very high. Now, are those variants going to be more aggressive, more transmissible and more dangerous? We don't know. But I think we should have at least some commitment to the principle of prudence. That's why we are proposing a pandemic vaccine pool, a 600 million dose buffer to protect COVAX supplies from future disruptions. Because in fact, let me tell you, during this period, there were different, extremely dramatic moments where we had no vaccines. I was following that on a day-to-day basis because, as you know, Gavi has the responsibility in the management of COVAX. So we had no vaccines. And why we have no vaccines? Partly it was already said by previous speakers and also by the public because of, I would say provocatively probably, there is a virus for which we have not yet found a vaccine. It's nationalism. That's the virus. Even with the competent people at CEPI, we have not yet been able to find a vaccine for nationalism. And so we had export restrictions. We had excessive stockpiling. We had the behavior of some manufacturers that put COVAX behind and there was an outbidding. They sold vaccines to those who were paying more. That's the reality. There was bad behavior from governments and from manufacturers. So I think we should learn this lesson and we should prepare still for this pandemic because it's not over. At least we should address, as it was said by Mark Zussman, the priority groups. In Africa, there are many countries where even the priority groups have not yet had their shots. They are not yet vaccinated. So we have to finish the job. And also we have to be proactive because until now we have been only reactive. That's the point. The international community, including the richer countries in the world, the most powerful countries in the world, they have been reactive. So, and we have spoken by doing the G20. I was there in some events. I spoke with the then chair, Mario Draghi, and others. Everybody's speaking about pandemic preparedness, about what's next. And when we propose something as simple as a vaccine buffer of 600 million doses, it seems that we are proposing something that is very strange. No, it's not strange. For me, this is the first test of pandemic preparedness, to know if donors are ready or not to fund a kind of buffer for pandemic preparedness. So the pandemic is not over. Let me a little bit even more provocative. Maybe we should give President Putin a Nobel Prize of Medicine, because apparently he made COVID disappear. We don't no longer see COVID-19 in the media all over. By the way, to be frank, even before this terrible, dramatic crisis, in Ukraine, the reality is that because the richer countries already were more or less vaccinated, it was already second priority. But it's not yet. There is a problem of equity. It's still there. So I think we have to finish the job. And for that, we need those $5 billion. And we hope that the donor fatigue that we are seeing in many quarters will not prevent us from doing what it should be done.
Those are interesting findings, José, and we appreciate your feedback. Ian, how does the missed shot on equitable vaccine distribution impact politics moving forward? And is there a chance to right the wrong in the recovery phase?
Well, first of all, my applause to José for suggesting a Nobel for Putin for medicine there. There is no question. If the good news is we're not talking about the pandemic, we don't like the bad news right now. And of course, the point is a somber one. We're not talking about the pandemic. We are. The world is not, has not for a week. It's still with us. And it's particularly with parts of the world that are not rebounding the way the developed world is. And this is the problem. This is the missed shot. It's not just about vaccines. It's about the economy. For 40 years now, the major accomplishment of globalization was the emergence of a global middle class. But the nationalism, the populism, the geopolitical recession that we're in presently all contributes through the pandemic to a reality where the developed world, the advanced industrial economies are now, they've rebounded sharply. They are back on track with where they were before the pandemic hit. They had a massive hit and then they had a V-shaped recovery. It was extraordinary. The economic ministries and the governments made that happen. What are we looking at for the middle income countries, the lower income countries? Nothing close to that. In fact, their indebtedness is vastly higher now, and their ability to pay that off, as well as to try to deal with the growing challenges of their own middle class that still is suffering from the knock-on effects of this pandemic. And don't get us started with $115 oil as of today, gas prices that are record, grain prices that are shooting way up because we're at war again. So no, this is a horrible, horrible thing for the developing world and for the trust of the leaders of the developing world that the advanced industrial economies are prepared to do anything for them. And this is going to play out not only in terms of the pandemic going forward, but climate change. I was talking to John Kerry a few days ago in Munich, and he basically said, yeah, middle income economies, the best we can do for them is invest heavily in technology so it'll be cheaper for them to go to renewables because we're just not going to have the money to provide to them. We have to focus on the lower income economies and give them at least more capacity to leapfrog away from fossil fuels. These leaders from these developing countries are going to be incredibly angry and mistrustful the next time the world leaders come to them, the G7 comes to them and says, here's what we need you to do. Really? Well, here's what we need you to do, and you're not doing it. That's a big problem. And I think José put his finger on it, and it's not getting better.
So we still have to deal with a lot of mistrust, even as we work towards international global cooperation. Mark, you recently hit the milestone of 15 years, and congratulations with the Gates Foundation. How would you weigh the global response to the pandemic compared to other public health challenges you've tackled? And what lessons do you hope were learned these past 2 years?
Yes, well, I think the biggest lesson, I was still at the United Nations before I joined the Gates Foundation, is what Dr. John was referring to, which was the transition that became the Global Fund to Fight HIV, TB, and Malaria, and PEPFAR, which was at the early 2000s, which took, as he said, 15 years of deaths around the world and a big time lag of many years for getting the world's responding to get antiretrovirals and other tools on HIV specifically, but then also tackling long neglected diseases like tuberculosis and malaria. And so I think that is the closest analogy we have. And the world did in the end respond, albeit late. And it's been a very impressive response that has saved literally millions upon millions of lives over the last 2 decades. What we are seeing now in that response is, to some degree, back in the glass half full, half empty, a half empty response, because we've seen these delays and setbacks and the nationalism and the, again, many deaths that could have been averted had we had more equitable distribution. But we are at least trying to have the discussion that we're having on this panel today and saying that is unacceptable. As Jose was saying, that is not a world that we want to live in for the future, that we can afford to live in for the future, and that we need to then create collectively a structure that allows us to both finish the current response. And by the current response, I mean not just to the COVID vaccine delivery issues, but we have seen setbacks for the first time in HIV in Africa and more broadly. In malaria, after 2 decades of progress, steady progress, we've seen a reverse in the last couple of years. And on top of that, with the economic issues that Ian was talking about, we've seen increases in absolute poverty in sort of the lowest, the very poorest, after nearly 2 decades of steady reductions of hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty. So the wider impact of the COVID crisis, well beyond COVID itself, requires a very different focus, and it does require wealthier countries to step up. Jose also mentioned the G20 and the talk about pandemic preparedness in the future, and I was part of some of those discussions, and it still has been only talk. It's not as if they've put resources into that at the expense of the 5 billion we need for the stockpile now. We need both and those are still very small amounts of money relative to what's been spent for the total economic response, especially in high-income countries to COVID. And it's fully self-interested in terms of the economic damage and the kind of steps that Melanie outlined that we need to be able to put in place. That's a CEPI plan, but that should be a global plan around all of that. For the 100 days, we should be able, as a world, to be able to identify, sequence, create, and then manufacture at scale and at risk, future treatments, future vaccines, and so on. And the bottom line is, right now, the world is not stepping up as it should and needs to be. And we always try to be optimistic at the Gates Foundation that we're going to see that change. But I think it's going to require a very determined advocacy campaign against some quite tough headwinds that Ian and others have been describing.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, Mark, what has been the impact of the $2 billion the foundation has spent, and what do you hope to focus on next?
Well, again, $2 billion is a lot of money in absolute terms and a small amount of money, again, in relative terms. And some of that has been support to COVAX and CEPI, our partners on the call. Some of that has been at national level response. There's been a lot of strong partnership with the Africa CDC and Dr. John. And then also working with pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers and others about, from diagnostics to therapeutics to the vaccine development. And so in all of those, we try to be catalytic, meaning that we can't plug gaps for governments or the private sector, but we can accelerate, we can put risk capital in place before products, say, have regulatory approval. And I think that's been an important role that we've played. Going forward, we're helping work on some of the areas like Dr. John cited on, can we help with some of the seroprevalence studies so we can think about what the right responses are in geographies across the world where we know what the actual impact of COVID has been. I saw the US CDC recently came out and said they estimated that 140 million Americans have actually had COVID, probably, which is much larger than the official number. And around the world, we don't have that data yet post-Omicron or what those sorts are. So we're looking at ways that we can help support that. But in the end, our real push is this has got to be a global public good of the purest kind. This is in the self-interest of all countries on the planet to reinforce and support the global institutions from the WHO to Gavi to CEPI that work on these issues. And back to Ian's somewhat pessimistic point about whether the potential for geopolitics, especially the US-China geopolitics, to overcome that, I still have some hope, maybe naive, that there is a shared interest, for example, in deep investments in surveillance across the world, including in Africa, to help identify the next outbreak before it comes out, and that common interest can still overcome some of those national interests, but we'll see.
I really like what you said about us thinking about this as a global public good and the need to support global institutions such as the WHO and the Africa CDC, amongst others, many others. Melanie, one thing is clear. This was a great moment for science and vaccine development. I really love what you said earlier, that we fit 10 years of development into 1 year. How can the learnings here, particularly of the mRNA technology, benefit the world moving forward?
Yeah, I think it is fair to say it's been a great moment for science, but obviously in this conversation, it's still not a great moment for equitable access. So if you're looking at mRNA specifically, yes, it's been a great success. There's still a lot that should be done with the technology moving forward, which can move forward together with ensuring equity around those developments and those further innovations. mRNA specifically has been proven to be a rapid response platform for developing vaccines on COVID-19. But we need to take the mRNA technology to other infectious diseases like malaria, HIV, TB, emerging infectious diseases moving forward, to fully understand the potential for mRNA technology. We don't actually believe that it will be the answer to everything. Many other vaccine platforms are also really important in terms of some vaccines, and maybe better approaches in some circumstances. But as we move forward, developing vaccines against other infectious diseases, developing the manufacturing capability, and as I said, the globally distributed manufacturing, and looking at ways of getting manufacturing plants that can react to future outbreaks will be critical, and will all be part of ensuring that ultimately there will be access to the mRNA technology, now, no matter how it will be used in the future. And there are many ways that that technology can be used to fight infectious diseases.
Thank you for that, and for expounding on the very many ways this can help to fight many diseases such as HIV, malaria, and even cancer. And this brings us to our final poll question of the day. Which of these is the most positive impact of the pandemic? Growth of telemedicine, mRNA vaccine technology, greater focus on health and security? As we wait for the results, José, what can we do during this pandemic to ensure people have more global equitable access to health innovations and stronger health systems?
I think, first of all, there is an issue of political commitment that is very important, to give public health the priority it deserves. And now, speaking as a former politician, let me tell you that, in fact, that's not the case. But now, if it's not now, when? I think now the global leaders have seen how damaging a pandemic can be, not only in health terms, in humanitarian terms, but also from an economic point of view. The cost, I'm not going to repeat the values that were put forward by many institutions like the IMF, how much was the cost of this pandemic. So now we need to give it the priority test, because frankly, even in development aid, these issues of public health were not receiving the priority, because traditionally, by the way, it's easier to give direct budget support, or it's easy to find ways sometimes also with the interest of the more developed countries to invest in infrastructures. But health, we don't see the results immediately. Politically, it's not so good as to inaugurate something, inaugurate a bridge, or inaugurate sometimes a football stadium. So we need to give this the priority and invest in resilience. And resilience, so it's not about immunization. Of course, immunization is very important because, as was already said, by the way, by Mark, it's not just about COVID, it's about what we usually call routine immunization. So, and the reality is that now, infectious diseases like malaria, yellow fever, cholera, Ebola, all of these can be they have been suffering from lack of attention. And so we have to immunization is a very good way of its entry point for our health systems, for resilience of our health systems, because that's in some countries the first contact they have with the public health system. So, and also the investment we make in immunization, it's important, supply chains, cold storage, train healthcare workers, data systems, surveillance, all this is also for the health systems resilience. So I think we need to think about health resilience globally and linking it more, by the way, with economy. By the way, ESG, I usually say that we should not only say ESG, we should say ESGH, including health. Because now I know that from a professional point of view, now we see that a renewed commitment of the corporate entities all over the world for more ESG investments. Health can be one of the most important, let's say, investments they can do. Of course, in the interest of global solidarity, but also in the interest of supporting the economy. So these are areas where I believe we can indeed show that we have learned something. Some of them already mentioned. I will not. What Mel said. I know CEPI now is engaged in the process of, in fact, it will be here in London next Monday, I think, of having more resources for the development of the so-called 100 days policy. I really welcome that. I think this pandemic pool is also a test of commitment to resilience and to prevention instead of just reaction. So there are many, many issues where I think the lessons are there. And I hope that there will be now sufficient leadership, because at the end of the day, it's about leadership. I mean, are people ready or not to take the critical decisions that are, I believe, needed, including, as it was mentioned, about the global public goods. I think, as Jan said, I think the geopolitics don't look good. We see a much more decoupled world, and most likely because of this terrible war invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we'll see a more decoupled world, and that's very worrying. But is it possible, even in decoupled world, in trade, in financial, technological, political terms, to make the leaders accept that there are some areas like global public health or the fight against climate change when it makes sense to cooperate? I mean, we need leadership. And when I mean leadership, I mean not only from the public sector. That's why, for instance, I would like to have a word of thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, not because I'm now in an event organized by them, but because really what they have done, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of intellectual leadership, commitment. Because the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is, in fact, a very important signal post for all others, for the private sector. So when they show their commitment, it's also a signal for the private sector. So it's very important that we keep this commitment from the public and the private sector. That's something that in Gavi we are proud to do, is precisely to put together public and private partners for a global public good.
Thank you, Jose. Leadership, health resilience, and focusing on global public good. We will quickly now look at the results. Which of these is the most positive impact of the pandemic? 13% feel that it's a growth of telemedicine, 68% is the mRNA vaccine technology, and 19% greater focus on health security. Melanie Seville and Jose Manuel Barroso, thank you so much for your time today. In our remaining moments, I do want to give both Ian and Mark a chance to share some closing thoughts about all we've heard today. Ian, what stood out for you?
That poll that showed that 73% of the respondents thought that politics was the biggest challenge out there. I mean, we have the science, we have the money, but we don't have the politics. Reminds me Bill Gates when he did his annual letter about 10 years ago, and he said that there's no reason for poverty going forward unless we get the politics wrong. And ever since he wrote that letter, unfortunately, the politics structurally have gotten more challenging. But I mean, Mark had just said that, he said maybe he's naive in terms of the ability of the US and China to work together. I don't think he's naive. I think we have to work for that. The fact is that the Chinese understand that principally their geopolitical power comes from integration economically with the rest of the world. It's not like Russia, where it comes principally from their military power, and that Russia feels as left behind by globalization, or Putin does, over the last 20 years, as people that voted for Brexit and people that voted for Trump or people that voted for the hard left in the United States. Same thing, right? But in China, that's not true. In China, you have a population of well over 1 billion people that actually increasingly believe in a China dream. A lot of Indians feel that way too. A lot of Africans feel that way too. So, I mean, I think that is where you get a level of hope, that you can still work together on big global issues. But the point is that the developed world needs to do a lot more in terms of getting both its houses in order, as well as being willing to actually reach into the pockets and spend in ways that make sense for the long term, even if it's a little painful right now. This crisis creates an opportunity to do more of that, but we should not in any way be sanguine that that's going to happen easily or smoothly.
Thank you. We have the science, we have the money, but we don't have the politics, but this is an opportunity for us to get it right. Mark, your organization's newsletter is called The Optimist. I love the name. What are you optimistic about as we begin year 3 of the crisis?
Well, I'm optimistic about the partners that we've had on today's panel, that I think they are all representatives of examples of where the world has tried to rise up. The Africa CDC, the COVAX initiative led by Gavi, and CEPI are 3 global institutions that have stepped up and by their work have made this crisis much less damaging than it could have been, awful though it has been. So it shows the model that we can get resources, we can get science, we can mobilize governments. And the Africa CDC example is also, while we do need in an equitable world wealthy countries to step up, there also is the space for lower income countries to provide their own support and resources and do it in regional ways, like that's been done in Africa and Latin America and some other parts of the world. So I think on the optimism side, I'm determined to keep up. Ian tells me I'm not being too naive, just a little bit naive. And I think part of our role at a foundation like this is we need to be. We believe fundamentally in that vision that every person deserves the chance to a healthy and productive life. That's a shared vision, whether you're in Africa or China or India or the United States, and that that's something that all human beings still aspire towards, and that if we can help navigate some of these tough geopolitical currents of today and show, particularly in global health, the opportunity for collaboration and why that actually is helping yourselves as well as helping the world, then we do have some reasons for optimism, and we can build on some of those amazing scientific examples we've heard about.
Ian Bremmer and Mark Sussman, thank you both. And thanks to our sponsor today, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I am Natasha Kimani. It has been my pleasure moderating this fantastic group of panelists and listening to you all. Thank you for watching all the way from Nairobi. Have a fantastic and lovely evening. Thank you once again.
Yep.